Thank you very much indeed for this extremely kind introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And it's so kind of you all to come along this evening, especially in these freezing temperatures. And also thank you to our live stream audience, people who are watching online as well. Paris is my home city, and Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, was first published in New York, so I couldn't feel more at home here at the American Library in Paris. And I always say that if you really want to understand modern France, then a good starting point is the United States. The two republics grew alongside each other, and they established diplomatic relationship for the first time in 1778. Both grew out of cataclysmic revolutions against a crown, and both are highly idealistic. And in this respect, their histories are intertwined in a fascinating way, including in the manner their respective citizens express dissent. And that's why I quote the great American Francophile writer James Baldwin in the introduction to my book. And he said, "I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And I certainly think of Baldwin a lot when I'm in Paris, especially when visiting the less salubrious parts of the city. The joy of Baldwin was that he loved and he respected the glories of France, the kind that we see all over the 7th arrondissement here, but also in the area just across the river around the Élysée Palace. But he also got beneath the surface of a notoriously revolutionary country, and he tried to work out what was wrong. And he was particularly interested in immigrants, included unwanted immigrants, and they are a subject that couldn't be more relevant to France today. The big difference, I'd say, between Fixing France and similar books on the market is that I'm by no means a traditional writer from France. On the contrary, my background is in Algeria, which was once France's prestigious colony, the absolute jewel in the crown of the French Empire. And unlike similar imperial jewels, such as British India, Algeria was considered to be part of mainland France. It had its own MPs in the Paris National Assembly, French town halls, and more than 1 million or so so-called Pieds Noirs settlers from Europe. The indigenous Arab population was treated appallingly, not only in Algeria, but also in the French mainland, where many were sent to rebuild France after the Second World War. And I mean rebuild literally, not metaphorically. The Algerians were largely viewed as cheap labor without any significant political or indeed social rights. This year is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Algerian War of Independence in 1954. This cataclysmic conflict ended with victory for the Algerian nationalists in 1962. And this legacy still has enormous influence on modern France. The current makeshift Fifth Republic literally emerged from the Algerian War. And the hugely powerful institution of the French presidency, an alpha male, it's always been a male, with a vast security apparatus behind him, including thousands of paramilitaries, was designed to deal with the Algerian insurgents. Algerians were treated with great suspicion then, just as they are today. In fact, whole ethnic minority communities are excluded from France's national story and live on out-of-town estates that former socialist prime minister Manuel Valls said contributed to, I quote, a social, ethnic, territorial apartheid in France. Worse than that, ethnic minority groups are often stigmatized and portrayed in all kinds of unpleasant ways, and are often the victims of police brutality. I make such points strongly in Fixing France, but fear not, Fixing France is not a misery memoir, it's not a long series of complaints, it's ultimately a call for change, a call for action, if you like. And in this sense, Fixing France is very much a disruptive book. It follows in the great French tradition of dissenting progress, if you like, so it's very positive. It analyzes a whole host of subjects, in fact, key major topics ranging from politics to society, feminism, education, identity, but also extremism and terrorism. So in this sense, it doesn't shy away from very difficult subjects, and I think that's very important. And I would argue that the biggest story in France today is the very strong possibility of a far-right presidency in 2027. Emmanuel Macron will be gone by then, and the system allows for a very determined individual, such as Marine Le Pen, to win absolute power without any kind of parliamentary majority. She can then rule by decree while filling up her government with unelected politicians. Millions thought it was outrageous of Macron to push up the retirement age from 62 to 64 without a parliamentary vote. But just imagine what Marine Le Pen will get up to if she's in charge. Her party, the National Rally, is full of nostalgists who hark back to the days when Algeria was a colony. And in extreme cases, to when France was part of the Third Reich and indeed collaborated with it. As I explore in my book, the Rassemblement National was actually founded as the Front National in 1972 by men who had actually served in the Waffen-SS and thus sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler. But there isn't simply just a problem with the far right. The entire system is riddled with discrimination and prejudice. And as far back as 1948, James Baldwin arrived in Paris and reported on immigrants. He referred to them as les misérables, being, in his words even, treated like dirt. The unemployed and low-paid laborer from Algeria were particularly persecuted by the authorities, he said. And I do understand that discussing, such facts and indeed issues can bring discord and division between many people. But I think it's important to join the debate and indeed to try to make a difference. And that's why I've tried to make my book as honest as possible, and I've written it in a way that will appeal to anybody, whatever your background. And the clearest message I'd like to offer you all tonight is that the book is a straightforward read. It's not a stodgy academic theory, it's not a political manifesto. It's actually about my real life experiences, and it draws on cultural, historical, and political factors. But most of all, it's about a modern republic that is failing to live up to its once exalted reputation of liberté, égalité, and fraternité for all. And I argue in the introduction of my book that France, I use this phrase, is overwhelmed by idealism. It goes back to those who created the Republic based on sacred texts that focused on Enlightenment values that are impossible to apply to real life. Freedom and equality for one group of citizens means the suppression of another group. And that's why I conclude in my book on a more pragmatic note, quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, while also suggesting the need to move from this outdated Fifth Republic to a new iteration of the French Republic. So let me read the very last paragraph of Fixing France. These Republican illusions are not keeping up with the world. Alexis de Tocqueville, the Paris aristocrat who lost a grandfather to the guillotine of revolution, was referring to America when he said, "A nation's greatness comes not from being more enlightened than any other country, but being able to repair its faults." I would extend Tocqueville's theory to the broken French Republic. Its major fault lines are easy to pinpoint, and fixing them is possible. Change requires more than high-minded ideals. A concerted period of action is needed, and it is about time that a bold France rises to the challenge. The Fifth Republic is dead. Vive la Nouvelle République. And I very much hope that you will give Fixing France a choice, and most of all, that you will enjoy reading it.
Thank you so much, Nabila, for your intro. So I imagine this is something that the audience, and since we have a nice intimate audience tonight, I want to give time for everyone to ask questions. But I do just want to point out that the last time I was here was actually to talk to Cole Stangler, also a friend, about his book, Paris is Not Dead, which, similar to your book, discusses some of the major problems that France is confronted with, but in English. And I imagine, like tonight, there were very few French people in the audience for that event as well. So I want to ask you, who are you writing this book for, especially given that it's not written in your native language, which is English, and it's also not written in the native language of the country that it discusses. So who is it for?
Well, I would say, France is a fascinating country. It's of interest globally. Everybody has a view on France. France is the most visited country in the world. There's a reason for that. It attracts people from around the world for its beautiful landscapes, for its food, for its cultural assets. And there are a lot of people who globally ascribe to what France projects around the world. Its mode de vie, its joie de vivre. It's an Olympic city. It's going to welcome a great summer of sports this year. So there are numerous reasons why France is worth written about. Let's not forget that it's a global economy. It's a huge military power, but it's got a few things wrong as well. And I think the reason why I wanted to write the book is mainly to perhaps go beyond those myths and debunk those myths. So I should hope that my book will get translated in French eventually. At the moment, it's launched in the US, in Canada, and the rest of the Commonwealth. And I very much hope that it's going to come home. I think the French would welcome to do some soul searching. There's a reason why millions of them take to the streets to complain about what's wrong in their country, from social inequities to economic injustices. And there are certainly very good reasons to reflect on how France is governed and what it can do best to allow for a more cohesive, egalitarian society.
Now, debunking myths is a thread that runs throughout all of the different chapters of your books, and I want to talk about one of them. That's France being known for things like, the French Revolution, regular protests, strikes, constant political outreach, civic engagement. This image of a country that does not bow down before power, that demands that its elected officials really work for the people. And I think that's very different than the Anglo context that you talk about in your book. But a closer look at the country does contradict that cliche. To put it in your words, you say the conformism of French citizens is undeniable. How do you explain the disconnect between a country that indeed has been at the helm of so many major upheavals, societal upheavals, but is increasingly reticent to change?
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the first things that needs to be highlighted is how the French Republic was born. It was literally born on revolution. It was born on terrorism. It was born of violent dissent. And it's very important to bear that in mind to understand the nature of, the revolutionary nature of this country, which hasn't gone away. I would say one of the reasons that, that is difficult, the difficulty to bring about change, it's because the country is you know, you've got established elites at the top who are reluctant to part with their privileges, and you know, they're looking after each other. So you have political elites looking after business elites, looking after cultural elites, and it's very hard to for anybody who doesn't belong to those circles to have a look in. So if you come from a moneyed background, if you're born into privilege, you can go to good schools, and yes, you have a very good life in France, and you can enjoy all the good things about France. But it's much more difficult if you're born in rural France, or if you're born on a neglected housing estate. And as we've seen throughout the 7-year presidency of Macron so far, it's been marked and marred by a protest and very violent ones with it, to try to bring about change and make sure that those elites stop looking after themselves and literally live up to those idealistic principles upon which the French Republic was built.
Another one of the major themes of your books is politics, the idea being that one of France's major flaws is the current structure of its not only the structure of its government, but the Constitution of 1958, that is the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. You say that understanding the context under which that Constitution came into being is essential to understanding some of the flaws of that government structure. The Algerian War is at the heart of this. Charles de Gaulle, who I think for an Anglo audience is mostly just a post-war hero, is also at the heart of that. Can you talk more about the roles of those two things, of Charles de Gaulle and the 1958 Constitution, and bringing about the Republic that you criticize today?
Yes, I think there's an intricate link between the foundation of the Fifth Republic and the Algerian War of Independence. It was a time in the 1950s when France was on the brink of a civil war. You had, on the one hand, very determined Algerian nationalists who wanted Algeria to become independent, and on the other hand, you had very fierce French nationalists who wanted to cling on to Algeria. And it was a period marked by intense violence. There were assassination attempts, there were, you know, all sorts of terrorism happening on mainland France by a branch of the OIS, the organization of the secret army, who wanted to cling on to Algeria being French. And effectively, de Gaulle was brought out of the wilderness. He was this great war hero who was brought out of the political wilderness and effectively imposed military rule on that chaos. And he thought that a strong man was needed to bring an end to that chaos. And that translated into a constitution that gave him extraordinary powers to keep everybody in check, and gave him immense paramilitary units to look after him as well. And ever since then, you know, this constitution was brought about as an emergency measure to deal with that period of huge turmoil. But more than 65 years on, whoever becomes president of France retains those extraordinary powers. And that means that the president of France has very little checks and balances. Once they're elected through a 2-round vote, the president can rule by decree, thus bypassing parliament. He can choose his prime minister. He can form his cabinet. They don't have to be elected politicians. And that's a huge flaw in the system, because that means that if an extremist comes in, as I was suggesting, say a far-right candidate like Marine Le Pen, well, they can rule in the exact same manner and bring about even more extremist policies. And that, in my view, needs urgent fixing, because we need to go back to a system where the emphasis is on parliamentary democracy rather than presidential democracy, where parliamentarians have a say. They are representatives of the people. They should have a say about legislation. And that's that what France needs is more democracy. And the current system is a major flaw that needs changing. And, you know, it could be arguing for bringing about the Sixth Republic, for example, but a Sixth Republic could be, you know, the tag for shorthand for doing things differently. But the bottom line is we need to move on from this outdated system of governance.
So you call for a return to a parliamentary cabinet-heavy government, which would theoretically prevent one individual, the president, from running the show. But this has already been the case in France, notably in the Fourth Republic, which was dominated by chaos. Not only that, but we see countries that have a heavy parliamentary system today, notably the UK, that I think you could also argue are quite chaotic in terms of a lack of stability, a lack of longevity for their prime ministers, especially over the past 5-6 years. So why would that solution be any better now, and why is French society today better adapted to becoming less chaotic if that solution were to be put in place?
Well, because, you know, in France, the system has changed. We change republics. Each time there was a cataclysmic event. The Third Republic, we had a Franco-Prussian War, for example, that destabilized the system of governments. The Fourth Republic was destabilized by the war in Algeria. And that's why, you know, you had so much instability. I think 21 administrations in 12 years, revolving door prime ministers. It doesn't mean that the system of parliamentary democracy per se is not fit for purpose. It just means that we need to move on to another iteration of the French Republic. But I think, you know, democracy, having proper representatives of the people and having members of parliament, you know, legislating on bills is certainly a more healthy way of running a society than having an elected dictator, effectively. You know, that's the very definition of the current system.
Your book does not go easy on Emmanuel Macron, but I think it's worth mentioning that you penned an opinion piece in 2017 hailing his first 100 days in office, his early legislative agenda, his respect for the institution of the presidency, and even conceding that, I quote, running France is a thankless task. What changed your mind? Because he really seems to symbolize the totality of the flaws that you point out about France in your book now.
Well, first of all, you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. You know, looking at his program when he ran as a candidate, you practically couldn't fault it. He was a young man with a different vision of France. He claimed to be neither of the left, neither of the right, and, you know, transcend these political divisions and bring about a novel perspective on France. He was not even 40 when he became president of France. He's quite well traveled. You know, he's got ideas. You have to grant him that. But I think, and you've got to give him time. But time has not proven, has proven that he hasn't implemented what he had promised the country he would. He came in as a centrist, liberal, progressive individual. And he's turning into somebody who's anything but. Listening to his recent speeches and, crucially, the recent piece of legislation that he passed in Parliament, and notably the immigration bill, that is absolutely not what people elected him for. He's now in a situation where he's relying on extremists, the National Rally MPs, to pass a piece of legislation to basically keep anybody they identify as alien to France out, including people who are born in France, because this new proposed legislation will make it easier for people like me. For example, if I was, you know, being born in France to foreign parents, it would make it far more difficult for me to become French. So that's an absolutely reactionary, not to say xenophobic measure. And he didn't run on that.
Speaking of xenophobia, your book is organized into several thematic chapters that are focused on things like politics, the far right, protests, terrorism, education, identity, economics, even foreign policy. But race relations, even just pure racism, are recurring themes in almost every single chapter of your book, no matter the diversity of those different themes. So do you attribute many of France's modern ills to racism more so than things like class inequality, failed economic policy? In other words, is it so simple as to imagine that if France dealt better with its racial or religious minorities, that many of its problems would go away?
Well, I think France has a very difficult relationship with descendants, with people with a background that's rooted in their former colonies. In Africa, in North Africa. That's why you still have a huge constituency of voters in the National Rally, for example, or in right-wing or indeed far right-wing parties, or even on the far left, dare I say, that are still bitter about the loss of Algeria and the loss of their former colonies in general. So that makes life particularly difficult for people like me, and indeed for descendants of or for immigrants in general, because it places an anti in front of, it doesn't acknowledge our background. France's sense of identity is defined in a way that it rejects any other cultural or indeed religious heritage. You literally have to leave that at the door, or even, don't even it's not even acknowledged as part of your identity. And that creates a huge problem when it comes to discrimination. Because, for example, there are no data monitoring discrimination. There are no ethnic statistics. And I would contend that it's rather convenient for France's establishment, because they do not want to quantify what everybody knows already, that it's much harder to succeed in France if you have a foreign background. And that informs every aspect of life, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's job opportunities. So yes, that's why it's a recurring theme, because people like me end up often being the victim of that system. And at its sharper end, it's also translating into, as we see regularly, into police brutality, with agents of the state literally killing teenagers or young people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So that's something that's unacceptable. There needs to be a system in place where discrimination is monitored and it's taken, is dealt with as a serious problem. And at the moment, it isn't.
There's something I find really interesting in your book in how you lay out the ways in which the public system, especially in the context of public education, is not always more equitable as it's meant to be. In other words, sometimes emphasizing equality tends to have the opposite effect. I quote, you say, excellent private education is a fact of life in countries like Britain and the US, but France's Republican ideology is meant to be all about equality. And we know that the education system in France is extremely unequal. OECD study after OECD study have confirmed this. How do you explain this contradiction?
Well, I think, again, it's one of the myths that France projects. It projects the myth that it's based on meritocracy, but it isn't. You have to be very naive indeed to believe that. If you come from, again, a wealthy background, a privileged background, then yes, you'll do very well out of the system. You'll go to those grandes écoles and eventually end up like a Gabriel Attal or indeed his ex-lover holding the highest offices of the state. But if you are stuck on the housing estate and go to those underfunded schools, which a former socialist prime minister identified as apartheid France, then your chances of succeeding in life are much, much slimmer. You do have the occasional success stories, but most of the time, people from different, from ethnic minority backgrounds have to go abroad to succeed.
talk about police brutality, paramilitary policing, widespread inequality, far-right leaders, again, as being kind of recurring problems in France or risks that France is facing. But these are words that I think are often associated really with places like the United States and the United Kingdom. And you have a much different, you seem to offer a much different perspective about the way that the US and the UK treat these types of issues, a positive outlook, I'll say, at least compared to the way you see it in France. I think it's worth mentioning, you know, Trump was elected once, maybe even twice in the US. Recent reports have revealed serious issues with institutional racism in the UK, including in its policing system, its immigration system. So what is specific to France about the issues that you denounce?
Well, I think there certainly is racism in the entire French security state. And it's systematic because many of the police and indeed army units were in fact created at the time, at the height of France's colonial period. And if you look at Algeria, for example, you know, there was very specific brigades that were created to tame the unruly Algerians, not just in Algeria, but also on mainland France. And they were very violent units. They didn't play by the rules, and many of them still exist today, like the anti-criminal brigade, and of course there's the Foreign Legion, for example. And the Paris police was one of many units who, for example, that collaborated with Nazi Germany. They literally assisted the Nazis in persecuting the Jews during the Second World War, deporting them, and during the Holocaust. And even in the post-war years, this kind of violence perpetrated by police units remained. You only have to look at the treatment of Algerians in October 1961, for example, where up to 300 Algerians were murdered in central Paris. And that's within living history. And there's no coincidence that this legacy is still lingering, as we regularly see with the killing of young men from ethnic minority background. Nahel M was the latest victim of police brutality in 2022. He was a 17-year-old of Algerian and Moroccan background.
So what is it then that you about the Anglo model, be it in the US or in the UK, that you think works better than the French Republican model?
Well, I think that, you know, France doesn't really need to look at other countries to do things better. It only needs to look at its history and what it promises in its own constitution. And it needs to be a bit more pragmatic. For example, if you get rid of those heavy-handed, to put it mildly, paramilitary units that I mean, you only have to go to a demonstration in central Paris to see how they conduct themselves. I mean, I think, you know, there's no need, for example, for the use of tear gas, for example. It has to be said that tear gas is a chemical weapon that is banned in war zones, and yet it is used indiscriminately against civilian populations in any kind of demonstrations, whether, you know, it's to do with teachers asking for a pay rise or indeed a pension reform or anything else. And dare I say, we need to see a return of more neighboring policing, where the police works with people rather than against them. There are other methods, for example, in neighboring countries in Europe, where the police uses loudspeakers to interact with the crowds and give warnings, and so that demonstrations can happen and can remain orderly. Now in France, they are often banned because the government disagrees with the message. It's as simple as that. And that's evident when you look at pro-Palestine demonstrations. Initially they were banned. They can still be banned on a whim. And it's because the government disagrees with people from all faiths, from all walks of life, coming out and standing up for humanity. And it can take, it can instruct people to stay at home at any opportunity. And again, that's not desirable. You know, people are allowed to vent their anger and then their dissent, but they shouldn't be triggered by paramilitary units at demonstrations, and this causes immense violence.
Why this book now? Do you see France as being at a sort of inflection point of sorts?
I think this book is important now because I think that if the constitutional system is not changed urgently, France could face another crisis. I'm not saying it could manifest itself necessarily in a civil war, but it could manifest itself in a crisis of the institutions where, for example, the administration would stop working. We saw that. We had a hint of that in a way with the immigration bill, where some courts in local in local constituencies, for example, where judges said they would refuse to implement this legislation. So it could result, for example, in the civil servant system refusing to work if, say, Marine Le Pen manages to get to power. So I think, and also more generally, I think France is a country that retains a parochial view of the world. It sets itself against global ideas, and that's why you still have so many voters, millions of them, supporting parochial parties like the National Front, who put an anti before everything and anything. And France is not adapting to this changing world. And that's why it's more relevant than ever that it wakes up and looks around and see that the world has moved on, the world is more diverse, there are exciting things going on, and France needs to adjust to this reality. And what you get in France, and if you're a regular visitor to Paris, for example, you notice that there isn't much change that's happened over the decades. And I would say that it sums up where France is at the moment. It relishes on living off its myths, but that is not good enough.
I think there's an argument to be made, and I don't know how. I do want to have one last kind of sum-up question before we get to it, but I do, just to bounce off of what you said, think there's an argument to be made for the fact that France is also not an exception in that sense. I mean, we've seen far-right governments get elected one after another in almost all regions of the world. There's, not only places like India and Russia, there's the United States, there's Hungary, there's the Czech Republic. It's everywhere. It's not specific to France. So this idea that France needs to better adapt to a world that's changing, a world is also changing in a way that corresponds to some of the criticisms that you evoke about not only Emmanuel Macron, but even Marine Le Pen. We don't see a big progressive movement. So is France, again, different in that sense?
Well, there is always going to be people who are attracted by far-right or indeed extremist ideas. And there are many reasons why people are attracted to this kind of ideas, be it the cost of living crisis or indeed immigration. And people tend to retreat to an old-fashioned world. But the uniqueness about France is that it does, again, I go back to these constitutional mechanisms, it doesn't have the mechanisms to prevent an extremist from, again, running the whole show. For example, you have countries like Germany, they do coalition government really well, and that is aimed at keeping the extremists out of government. In Britain, you've got a parliamentary constitution that prevents extremists from sitting in parliament. You would certainly not have 89 members of parliament sitting in the British parliament. But in France, the system, there's a quirk in the system that allows one extremist to run the whole show. Again, bypass parliament, rule by decree, choose a prime minister, appoint a cabinet, whether they are cronies or business connections. And that is unique to France. And that's why it's very dangerous going forward when far-right ideas are indeed becoming so much more popular.
Time for one more. Okay, so just the last one. You argue again that modern France is built on idealism, values that are impossible to achieve, but I think it's worth talking about whether or not any country lives up to the ideals that it has. Can you fault a nation for setting high standards for itself?
No, in principle, there's nothing wrong with having high-minded ideas and indeed aspire for citizens to be treated equally, to be given equal opportunities, to have freedom and to have a sense of justice. But again, and I go back to Tocqueville and his criticism, it's not about, you know, a nation shouldn't be judged about how high its ideals are. It's how practical it is. How do you implement those ideals? And once you identify that there are cracks in the system, that things that have gone wrong, that we have deviated from those ideals, then you need to be practical about them and repair the faults, repair the broken promises. And France is not prepared to do that. In actual facts, it uses those ideals as a shield to say, well, this is on paper, this is on the constitution, there's nothing wrong with France, move on. But meanwhile, the reality is you've got a clique of establishment figures who are doing extremely well out of this system and who are extremely reluctant to deliver on the promises of the constitution. So no, there's absolutely nothing wrong with high ideals, but there's something even better with implementing them.
Can we please have a round of applause? We are now going to open up to questions. So if you have a question in the room, please raise your hand high and we'll bring you the microphone. And if you are on Zoom, please put your question in the box. I'm just going to come around.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I'm a retired U.S. diplomat who actually spent some time in France looking at this country over the decades and the evolution. I also served in Algeria, so I fully understand the French-Algerian connection in terms of the historical background to all of this. There's a lot that I could ask you, but I'm going to concentrate on just one thing, which is sort of brought up at the penultimate question before we open it up to general questions, and that is, to what extent do you attribute the collapse, if not the virtual disappearance, of the established left in France to the current situation? I mean, we've had the situation where La Macronie has basically devoured what exists of the former Socialist Party. The Socialist Party is a shadow of its former self, and there is really nobody out there articulating a vision that even begins to aspire to the progressive ideals of the French Constitution, much less the Declaration of Human Rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering to what extent that factors in and to what extent the need to rebuild that alternative, that progressive leftist establishment alternative is critical to going forward, because right now all you're going to have between now and 2027 is a battle on the right end of the political spectrum between the far right and the center right over who's actually going to be able to capture enough votes to get into the second round and potentially win.
That's an absolutely, it's an extremely pertinent question, and it's a very important one, especially if we bear in mind the forthcoming presidential election in 2027. And I think you're absolutely right. In principle, France remains a very left-wing country. It's a very socialist country in many ways. It's very much on the left. And if you add up all the votes of all these left-wing parties, from the Socialist Party to the Communist Party to the ecologists to all the minor parties on the left, they could easily win the presidency. But they are massively divided, and they are far more ideologically interested in fighting each other than actually gaining power and doing something about the country and implementing their ideas in a government where you will have a coalition of all these views that could, in my view, work together extremely well. But I think the biggest story of post-war France is actually the collapse of the center-right. And I think the collapse of the two major political parties, the Socialist Party and indeed the Gaullist Party, is what led to the rise of the far right. It's what paved the way for it, in the sense that you had a post-war party that was molded upon the ideals and the values of de Gaulle, a republic that was meant to be irreproachable, built on Christian values, built on values of integrity, on morality. The Gaullists always saw themselves as, you know, standing out in terms of, representing France in its most noble manner. But if you look at the reality of the center-right today, it's actually mired by corruption. You've got people like Nicolas Sarkozy, who's an indicted criminal. The late Jacques Chirac was also an indicted criminal. Fillon, and so there's no trust left in the center-right. So it's easy for somebody like Macron to come in and claim that center. And so he very much exploited that absolute collapse of the center-right and the implosion of the Socialist Party derived from mainly from the legacy of François Hollande. And another aspect that explains the rise of the far right in such a dramatic way is that it has become massively mainstream. You know, there were days where Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of the National Front, a convicted racist, Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, Islamophobe, you can't get more fascist than that. His party has actually very strong links with fascism, including Nazism, as I was rehearsing earlier. Founding members of the National Front were literally Waffen-SS veterans, or indeed members of the milice, who collaborated, the French who collaborated with Nazi Germany. But he was treated as a pariah. He was marginalized. His views were certainly not treated as mainstream, whether when he was interviewed or indeed criminalized. But nowadays, you hear the exact same views being projected in the media in such a prominent and incessant ways that, in a way, it made his ideas and the ideas of his daughters massively mainstream. And I think that's where France is losing its soul, frankly.
We have a question from Zoom. Fred asks, which political leaders in France today embody or reflect the ideas that you present, or most likely are to move us, or in France, in the direction you would like?
Well, that's almost a very personal question. I frankly struggle to see anybody, as actually this gentleman was suggesting, that really does France justice. There is this great polarization of politics, and it feels like there isn't a reasonable middle ground anymore, where, again, in an ideal world, like-minded people who are genuinely interested in, implementing those very noble principles would work together in order to achieve that. And it seems to be more French politics seems to be more about political infightings nowadays, rather than having a genuine interest for the country. You only have to look at the recent reshuffle, for example. the cabinet reshuffle. I mean, why on earth, you know, resurrect controversial politicians such as Rashida Dati? She was an infamous, injustice minister. You know, she's mired by allegations of corruption of all sorts, including a very dramatic story involving kidnappings and stuff like that. And yet, she's making a comeback. And she's making a comeback for the sole purpose of tapping into the far-right constituency. That is absolutely baffling. We have a president who has reassured us a number of times that his sole purpose was to keep the far-right out. But now he's not only passing legislation in parliament with the far-right, but he's bringing in people in his government who have very unsavory views and indeed extremist far-right views. So it's really despairing to see decent politicians who actually stick to what they say. And there I say Macron is a master of delusion. And you would all have noticed his classic phrase, en même temps. I mean, how can you possibly run any political party based on the phrase at the same time? You can't have on the one hand and on the other hand. You have to have clear direction. To lead a country, that's what's expected from a leader. You're not expected to sit on a fence and keep everybody happy, including tapping into extremist votes because you find them useful to stay in power. So I have a rather disillusioned view of French politics at the moment, and I really struggle to see, you know, decent politicians who are genuinely intent on bettering the nation.
We have time for one more question in the room.
Thank you so much. Great talk. Very good moderation. Thank you very much. Question: what if any are facets of France or French culture, the people, the socio status that you think are in favor of creating the world that you'd like this country to belong to? Like, what does France have in its favor to move us in the direction that you very eloquently suggested is a better one?
Well, France has a lot in its favor. It has its history, it has its culture, it's had its, you know, its beautiful countryside, it's got its beautiful landscapes, it's got, you know, an amazing heritage in so many ways. You know, it's the home of human rights, for example. It's been at the vanguard of revolutions and indeed inspired of other countries, including, as I was saying, the American Republic. But it's getting complacent, and I dare I say it believes in, you know, all these founding myths. It romanticizes these myths, and it can do better than that. French identity is still very much based on that romantic idea, but there's a very strong refusal to accept that the reality has changed, that the world is multicultural, that the world is diverse. To take, for example, my own family, my father was asked to come to France to rebuild France. You know, I'm the product of that. I was born in France, I was raised in France, I hold the French passport, yet I'm not being seen as French. I'm not being given the same opportunities as other French citizens from a more wide background, to put it bluntly. So it doesn't, you know, it seems perhaps, it seems frustrating, you know, for people like me to have to say these things, because they're common sense. You know, a lot of countries have realized that, and they have acknowledged that diversity is actually a strength. It doesn't hold you back. And I had to go abroad myself to further my chances. When I moved to the US and then to the UK, nobody has asked me for a CV. No, they asked what I could offer. Well, I could write, I could broadcast, I could teach. And I was given opportunities on that basis. And on the strength of my skills, I could speak other languages, French, Arabic, could do other things. But all these assets were held against me in France. An Arabic-sounding name, a Muslim surname, Muslim heritage, an undesirable postcode on one of those housing estates. All that was held against me, not to get to the schools that will get you somewhere in life in France. So it is frustrating, and the clear message is, we should see more people who deserve to be in positions of power and less Rashida Datis, dare I say.